That means when you get back to America, you have to make inquiry how I will get to America, right?
I'm going to do that, babe. I am going to get in touch with the immigration lawyer.
She might go back to her country and she might change her mind on most of the promises, like bringing me to her country, the visa.
Daniel is standing there like his whole world is collapsing. Lisa is crying like she is being torn away from the man she fought, lied for, defended, and still chose, and for one raw second, the scene sells itself as pure heartbreak, the kind of goodbye reality TV loves because it looks messy enough to feel true. But this is where the story gets more interesting and much uglier, because the tears are loud, the hugging is intense, the panic is visible, yet the pain does not seem to be coming from the same place, and that difference is where the whole relationship starts to crack open in public. Lisa looks like a woman grieving a love story she still wants to believe in, a future she has already paid for with embarrassment, chaos, stress, and blind hope, while Daniel looks like a man watching control slip through his hands at the worst possible moment, because once she gets on that, plain the heat of the trip ends. The pressure of being together ends, and all the promises they made face the one thing relationships like this usually fear most: distance, time, and too much room to think. That is why this goodbye matters more than all the kissing, all the reassuring words, all the soft talk about missing each other. Because emotion is everywhere here, but emotion on its own proves nothing, and Daniel keeps giving away the same detail whenever fear hits him hardest. America, visa, the future, the plan, the next step, the thing waiting on the other side of Lisa. Not only Lisa herself, and that is the hook hiding inside the tears. Because if this was only about love, the panic would sound different. The fear would land differently, and the goodbye would feel like losing a person, not losing access to a life. So while both of them look shattered in this airport scene, one question starts hanging over everything from the first minute. If Daniel is so heartbroken by losing Lisa, why does his fear keep sounding like fear of losing America? By the next morning, the mood turns weird in the way these relationships always do after a blow-up, because nothing looks fully resolved, nothing sounds stable, yet both people start acting like the worst has passed. Like one soft night and a few calm words somehow wiped out all the lies, pressure, and suspicion, and that fake calm matters because it creates the perfect cover for the pattern sitting underneath Daniel's behavior, which is not direct repair, not clean reassurance, and not present tense commitment, but delay. The awkward intimacy conversation makes that pattern impossible to miss, and not because of the shock value people will latch onto first, but because of what Daniel does with the tension the second Lisa asks for something now, which is push the answer forward, push the comfort forward, push the fulfillment forward. After marriage, later soon, another promise parked in the future where it cannot be tested today, and that is the first clear receipt. Because he is not fixing disappointment, he is managing it, he is not closing the gap, he is stretching the timeline and asking her to stay, emotionally invested, while the reward keeps moving further away. That habit is the point, because once you spot it here, you start seeing the bigger structure with uncomfortable clarity, the same rhythm, the same soft deferral, the same way pressure gets handled through future talk instead of present proof, and suddenly this stops looking like one awkward couple argument and starts looking like a relationship built on delayed payoff, where Lisa is asked to keep believing today because tomorrow is always being sold as the moment when everything will finally make sense. And once that clicks, the airport panic later does not feel random at all, because this was never only about romance going wrong or chemistry falling flat, it was also about timing, control, and who needed the future to arrive before the present had too much time to fall apart. This trip had everything people point to when they want to call a relationship doomed. Fights that drained the air out of every room, lies that kept changing the emotional temperature, awkward family rituals, approval drama, humiliation, suspicion, money stress, and the kind of exhaustion where nobody should feel more attached by the end, yet Lisa does. And that is what makes her side of this story sadder than the easy jokes. Because she is not walking away from Nigeria thinking none of this was worth it. She is walking away still wishing she could stay, still wanting the relationship to survive, still acting like the chaos was the price of admission to some future that will finally make all this pain look meaningful. That part matters because Lisa is not only holding on to Daniel as a person, she is holding on to the belief that all the struggle has to lead somewhere. Otherwise, she has to face a much harder truth, that she suffered through lies, pressure, and public embarrassment for a relationship that never had the same meaning on both sides, and people avoid that realization for as long as they possibly can, especially when they have already poured time, emotion, and money into the fantasy. Then you look at Daniel and his push for marriage before she leaves, and the tone changes fast, because for Lisa, marriage reads like love made official, but for Daniel, in my opinion, marriage reads more like security, a locked step, a firm hold on the next stage, something solid enough to survive distance, doubt, and changing moods once she gets back to America, which is why the failure to make that happen before the trip ends feels bigger than disappointment. It feels like loss of control. And once marriage falls through, Daniel is left with something much weaker than certainty, promises, and that is where the pressure starts building. Because a promise can be delayed, a promise can cool off, and a promise can fall apart the second reality gets more time than fantasy. Once the goodbye gets close, Daniel stops sounding like a man who only wants reassurance and starts sounding like a man who needs the process to stay alive the second Lisa lands back in America, because he keeps returning to the same pressure point over and over. Immigration, the next move, the visa path, the lawyer, the plan, and that repetition is the clearest on-screen receipt so far that fear is pulling him toward action, not reflection. He does not want a vague promise of future love. He wants motion. He wants proof. He wants something official starting before time and distance get. A chance to do what they usually do to relationships built on trip energy and borrowed intensity. Lisa responds in a completely different language. Not romantic language, not panic language, but practical language. Work, money, legal advice, timing, which visa route makes sense, how fast any of this can even happen. And that contrast matters because it strips the scene down to its raw structure. Daniel is pushing urgency while Lisa is describing process. Daniel is asking for speed while Lisa is talking about real-world limits. And once that mismatch becomes visible, the relationship stops feeling like a simple emotional separation and starts feeling like a system under strain. Nigeria gave them closeness, daily contact, ritual, physical chemistry, emotional noise, and the illusion that intensity itself meant progress, but America is going to replace all of that with bills, long waits, paperwork, job pressure, outside opinions, and worst of all for a relationship like this, silence. The kind of silence where people finally hear their own thoughts without someone kissing them, pleading with them, or keeping them busy enough to avoid the obvious. That is the reversal sitting underneath all the tears, because distance is not only sad for Daniel, it is dangerous, since the farther Lisa gets from the trip, the closer she gets to asking whether this relationship still makes sense when emotion is no longer doing all the heavy lifting. Then the money issue slides in, and this is where the story gets colder, because Lisa is no longer talking like a woman floating on romance, she is talking like somebody who has hit the wall. She says the money has to stop, the spending has to stop, and every dollar now needs to go toward the immigration process, the lawyer, the paperwork, the thing she still believes will bring this whole mess to a happy ending. And to be fair, Daniel does not explode. He does not fight her on the spot. He nods along. He accepts the limit, but not cleanly, because he leaves the smallest door open. Emergencies, hard times, unexpected problems, all the soft little phrases people use when they want to respect a boundary in public while quietly protecting a way around it later. That is why this part matters. Not because asking for help during real hardship is some crime, but because on shows like this the exception often becomes the pattern, and once that crack is left open, pressure has a habit of finding it. The first urgent need becomes the second, then the third. And soon enough the rule is still there on paper, while the relationship keeps getting managed through loopholes, which is why the audience hears that caveat and immediately stiffens, because these money arrangements almost never age with grace. They age like milk left in a hot car. Then, Daniel gives away the line that lands harder than any dramatic speech when he talks about Lisa having plans for him, when he speaks about her as the route to America, the holder of the future he wants, and there it is again. Not some grand love declaration, not a clean statement of devotion, but a slip that says more than he seems to realize, because the center of gravity keeps pulling back to process, access, arrival. By this point, the pattern is hard to ignore, and the sharpest read is also the simplest one. He is not trying to prove love to the audience, he is trying to keep access alive for himself. Daniel gets mocked so easily in a story like this that people skip past the part that makes the whole situation more believable, which is that he does not need to be empty in order to be self-interested. He might care about Lisa in his own way. He might feel attached to the attention, the loyalty, the comfort, the affection, the way she chooses him even after all the chaos. And he might honestly dread losing the person who has been feeding him emotional security while also representing a path to something bigger. Because human motive is rarely neat, especially on this show where love, need, fantasy, and survival keep crawling into bed together and pretending they are one clean feeling. That is why the strongest read is not the cartoon version where Daniel feels nothing and every tear is fake, because that reading is too easy and honestly less useful. The messier truth is what gives the story teeth. He might mean some of his soft words. He might miss her kisses, her presence, the daily closeness, the feeling of being wanted. And when he talks about missing her, there is enough emotion there to keep the scene from feeling totally hollow. But the problem is not whether he feels something. The problem is what rises to the top the second fear hits him hardest. That is the test that keeps exposing the split in motive. Because when panic comes in, he does not keep returning to Lisa as a person. He keeps circling back to promises, to America, to what happens next, to whether the future stays on track, and that is where his tenderness starts colliding with his own words, since he can sound sweet in one breath and then reveal, almost without noticing, that what terrifies him most is not only losing a woman, but losing the plan attached to her. So the contradiction is what matters most here, because Daniel speaks like a man feeling closeness, then panics like a man protecting an outcome, and once those two things start sharing the same sentence, the goodbye stops looking like simple heartbreak and starts looking like emotion mixed, with ambition in a way that never sits clean. At the airport, the noise of the whole trip finally drops away, and all that is left is the part nobody can hide from, separation. And Lisa starts breaking before the goodbye is even finished, which tells you how much of herself she has tied to this relationship. Because for her, this is not only leaving a man behind, this is stepping away from the story she has been trying to force into meaning after all the lies, all the humiliation, all the emotional mess, all the moments where a smarter version of herself should have stepped back and asked why love kept feeling like damage control. Yet, she stayed. She defended it. She kept reaching for the version of this relationship where the suffering turns into payoff, where the tears mean devotion, where the chaos was somehow leading to a future worth having. Daniel, on the surface, gives her everything the moment requires: comfort, closeness, soft words, the look of a man who cannot bear to let go, and to be fair, some of that emotion may be real. Because losing daily access to someone who gives you affection, loyalty, and belief is a loss even when your motives are mixed. But this scene still feels heavier for another reason, because he is not only facing the loss of presence, he is facing the collapse of momentum. The trip is ending. The distance is starting. The certainty he wanted is gone. And the future he thought he was moving toward now depends on time, paperwork, money, patience, and Lisa staying committed once the intensity of Nigeria fades into the slower, colder rhythm of America. That is why the goodbye lands with so much weight, because both of them are devastated, both of them are clinging, both of them are acting like letting go might destroy something they still need, but the brutal truth sitting underneath the hugs is the part neither seen nor tears can fully hide. Lisa is holding on to the love story she has already paid for, and Daniel is holding on to the future he thought he was close to securing. And those are not the same thing. Once Lisa gets home, the whole mood changes. And not in some small cosmetic way where they miss each other for a few days and then pick up where they left off, but in the way reality always changes relationships that were being carried by intensity. Because the stage lights go off, the trip is over. The airport tears stop doing the work, and suddenly there is no more Nigeria bubble protecting them from the questions they kept outrunning. No more family rituals making the relationship feel official. No more physical closeness patching over tension. No more daily emotional theater turning. Pressure into passion. And that is the point where whatever this relationship is has to survive on behavior alone. That is a much uglier test than the goodbye itself, because behavior is slower, less flattering, and much harder to romanticize, and once Lisa is back in America, the list of pressures starts stacking up fast: visa delays, work stress, money limits, paperwork, legal confusion, outside opinions, long silences, boring routines, old doubts creeping back in, and the kind of distance that gives both people too much time to think about what they are getting and what they are giving, which is dangerous for Lisa because the love story starts looking less magical when she is no longer inside the trip, and dangerous for Daniel because patience sounds noble until the process stops moving and the reward stops feeling close. That is where fantasy starts losing pieces one by one, because waiting exposes motive, scrutiny exposes weak spots, and boredom exposes whether there was ever enough substance to survive ordinary life in the first place, and if this relationship was being held together by two different dreams, one romantic and one practical. Then the next stretch is not about whether they cried hard enough at the airport. It is about which dream breaks first when emotion cools down and reality takes over. Lisa's love story or Daniel's patience.long-distance relationships do not fall apart only because people stop caring. And this franchise has shown that over and over without needing anyone to invent extra drama, because distance does not create every problem, it exposes the ones people were able to ignore while they were busy being together. And that is what makes Lisa and Daniel harder to watch once the trip ends, since the issue is no longer whether they cried, kissed, promised, or held on at the airport. The issue is whether the structure underneath all that emotion was ever built to survive real time, real delay, and real pressure. Lisa is looking for one kind of proof. Proof that the lies, the stress, the embarrassment, the family drama, the money strain, all of it was leading somewhere. Because if the relationship stalls now, then she is forced to sit with the possibility that she did not suffer for love, she suffered for a fantasy that kept moving every time she got close to touching it, while Daniel is looking for a completely different kind of proof. Proof that the process is alive, that America is still on the table, that the plan has not cooled off, that the promises are still moving toward a result. And those two needs sound similar only if you stop listening too early, because one is emotional payoff and the other is forward motion. That mismatch is where long waits become brutal, especially in relationships tied to immigration stress. Because waiting does not hit both people the same way. One person starts asking whether the connection still feels true, the other starts asking whether the outcome is still possible. And once those questions split apart, every delay starts doing more than slowing the process. It starts revealing who was committed to whom, who was committed to what, and whether the bond was strong enough to survive when desire had to sit quietly next to paperwork, bills, silence, and doubt. And that is the part that makes this story sharper than a simple scam narrative. Because once a relationship starts running on two separate dreams, delay stops being dead time and starts becoming a truth serum. The ending only works if you do not flatten it into some lazy answer where one person was fully real and the other was fully fake, because that is too neat for what this scene is showing, and the reason the airport goodbye hits so hard is because the emotion is not false. It is simply not clean. Lisa's tears feel tied to the love story she still believes in, the future she has defended through lies, humiliation, stress, and all the moments where she could have backed away but chose to stay inside the fantasy a little longer, while Daniel's tears feel tied to a different kind of loss. Not only the loss of her presence, which may hurt in its own way, but the loss of momentum, the loss of certainty, the loss of the future he thought was getting close enough to touch. That is why the scene stays messy even after you pull it apart. Because both people can be hurting, both people can be scared, both people can feel something real in the moment, and still be grieving two different things. Lisa grieves the relationship she wants to become true. Daniel grieves the possibility that the path attached to that relationship slips out of reach. And once you see that split, the whole trip starts to read differently. The soft words hit differently. The promises hit differently. Even the panic hits differently. Since the louder the fear gets, the more the hidden motive starts leaking through the cracks. And that leaves the story in a harsher place than a clean breakup or a clean romance, because tears do not settle motive, intensity does not repair a weak structure, and distance does not destroy the strongest relationships first. It exposes the misaligned ones first, the ones where both people are committed, but committed to different outcomes. One to love, one to arrival, one to emotional payoff, one to practical payoff, and once those two tracks stop overlapping, all the hugging in the world cannot make them the same thing. So no, the goodbye was not fake, but it was not pure either, and that is why it lingers, because what looked like one heartbreak was hiding two separate panics in the same embrace, and if you think this one was messy, wait until you see the next couple where the romance looked intense on camera. But the private incentives were pulling in opposite directions the whole time.